The giant cowboy was still holding the inheritance deed when Maggie Ellis stepped down from the wagon and heard him ask, "How soon are you selling your third?" Dust curled around her boots outside High Mesa Ranch. Gideon Tate towered beside the corral, silent and rigid, while Maggie tightened her grip on the document box her uncle had left behind. "I haven't decided to sell anything." By sundown, they would learn the ranch owed far more than either expected, and Maggie had already found numbers that should not exist. "Stay with me and tell me, would you trust the land or the ledger?" The young horse had already broken one halter by the time Gideon Tate stepped into the corral. Dust hung above the rails in the pale morning light. The bay colt backed into the fence, eyes wide, nostrils working hard. Every time the rope tightened, the animal threw its head higher. "Easy," Gideon said. He stood 6'6" in his boots, broad enough through the shoulders that strangers sometimes moved aside before he asked them to. His hands looked large enough to force the colt into obedience. He did the opposite. Gideon let the rope go slack. The ranch hand outside the corral frowned. "You let him have that much line, he'll run you over." Gideon did not look away from the horse. "Then I'd best not give him a reason." The colt stamped. Gideon waited. Wind moved through the cottonwoods near the house. Somewhere behind the barn, a hammer struck twice against iron. High Mesa Ranch was already awake. 13 years had taught Gideon that frightened animals remembered force longer than men expected. So he stood still. The colt's breathing slowed first, then its head lowered. Only then did Gideon take one step forward. By the time his hand touched the animal's neck, the wagon from Red Creek was coming up the ranch road. Gideon heard the wheels before he looked. A 2-horse wagon rolled between the gateposts, carrying 3 passengers and enough road dust to turn the driver's black coat brown. One of the ranch hands called from the barn, "Mr. Tate, company." Gideon handed off the rope and climbed through the rails. He recognized the thin man sitting beside the driver. Walter Price, the Red Creek attorney who had handled Harvey Whitlock's estate since Harvey died in February. Gideon's jaw tightened. They had already inventoried the house, the cattle, the equipment, and every acre named in Harvey's papers. As far as Gideon knew, there was nothing left to settle. Then he noticed the woman sitting behind Price. She wore a dark traveling skirt and a plain cream blouse beneath a brown jacket. A narrow-brimmed hat kept most of the sun from her face. Beside her rested one leather valise and a square wooden document case with brass corners. She was black, perhaps 30, maybe a little older. She did not stare at the mountains the way newcomers usually did. She stared at the ranch, the barn, the corrals, the water trough. Then Gideon. The wagon stopped. Price climbed down carefully. "Morning, Gideon." "What's left?" Price brushed dust from his sleeve. "Enough that we ought to sit down." Gideon glanced toward the house. "Say it here." Price hesitated. The woman climbed down without waiting for anyone to offer a hand. Her boots touched the dirt, and she lifted the document case herself. Price cleared his throat. "This is Miss Maggie Ellis of Topeka, Kansas." Gideon waited. Price opened his leather folder. Harvey Whitlock did not own all of High Mesa. The yard seemed to lose its ordinary sounds. Gideon looked at him. "What?" Price removed a folded deed. In 1876, Harvey entered a partnership with Isaiah Ellis. Mr. Ellis provided capital during the expansion of the North Pasture and the purchase of the original breeding stock. The deed was properly witnessed. Harvey retained 2/3 ownership. Isaiah Ellis held 1/3. Gideon looked toward Maggie. Her face gave him nothing. Price continued. "Mr. Ellis died last winter. His interest passed under his will to his niece and sole heir, Margaret Ellis." Maggie spoke for the first time. "Maggie is fine." Her voice was calm. "Kansas in it, but not much." Gideon looked back at Price. "I worked beside Harvey 13 years. Never heard him say Isaiah owned 1/3. Whether he said it doesn't change the deed." Gideon took the paper. He read slowly. Harvey Whitlock, Isaiah Ellis. The acreage descriptions, the witnesses, the filing mark. Nothing's about it looked uncertain. Behind him, a shovel stopped scraping. The ranch hands were listening. Gideon folded the deed. How long before she sells? Maggie's eyes sharpened. Price looked uncomfortable. Gideon had meant the question for him. Maggie answered anyway. I haven't decided that I'm selling anything. Gideon turned fully toward her. Up close, the difference in their size was considerable. Maggie had to lift her chin to meet his eyes. She did. Gideon had seen men twice her width avoid looking at him when his temper was up. Maggie Ellis did not move an inch. What did your uncle tell you about this place? He asked. Enough to bring me here. That wasn't what I asked. It's the answer I have. A horse snorted behind them. Gideon stepped aside. Not closer. Aside. House is there. I can see it. For the first time, something almost like irritation touched her face. Price hit a cough. Before Gideon could answer, another rider appeared on the road. Charles Dunning came through the gate on a well-kept gray gelding, wearing a charcoal coat despite the growing heat. At 52, Dunning had silver at his temples, clean cuffs, polished boots, and the easy manner of a man whose name appeared on half the notes signed in Red Creek. He dismounted, smiling. Miss Ellis, I presume. Maggie looked at him. And you are? Charles Dunning, Red Creek Bank. Gideon disliked how quickly the banker had arrived. Dunning removed his gloves. I thought it best we speak before misunderstandings begin. He followed them into Harvey's old office. Maggie sat at the scarred desk. Gideon remained standing near the window. Dunning opened his case and placed a promissory note on the wood. High Mesa has an operating loan secured against livestock and certain ranch assets. Payment comes due after the autumn shipment. How much? Maggie asked. Dunning named the figure. Her hand stopped above the paper. Only for a moment. Gideon noticed. So? He asked. Maggie looked at Dunning instead. When was this balance calculated? Last quarter. Principal and accrued interest? Correct. Receipts for prior payments? In the bank records. I'll need copies. Dunning smiled. Of course. Maggie reached for the note. Gideon put 2 fingers on its corner before she could take it. You expecting trouble? She looked at his hand, then at him. I expect numbers to agree. Dunning gave a small laugh. I suspect Miss Ellis will discover ranch accounts are somewhat less tidy than Kansas office books. Maggie slid the note from beneath Gideon's fingers. Numbers don't know what territory they're in, Mr. Dunning. The banker's smile remained. His eyes did not. By noon, Price and Dunning had ridden back toward Red Creek. Maggie had not. Her valise stood inside High Mesa's front hall. Gideon found her in Harvey's office, opening drawers. You planning to inventory the spoons too? Only if the bank loan is secured by them. She pulled out a ledger. Gideon reached over and closed it. Not hard. Just enough. Maggie looked down at his hand. I need the cattle books, the loan records, and the autumn sales contract. You just got here. Yes. You own paper. You don't know this ground. Silence held between them. Maggie placed both hands on the desk. Then show me the ground. I'll show you the paper. Gideon stared at her. Outside, a ranch hand called for another coil of wire. A wagon creaked near the barn. Ordinary work continued while the shape of Gideon's life changed inside one small room. He lifted his hand from the ledger. Tomorrow. Today. His eyes narrowed. Maggie opened the book. You want to know whether I'm selling High Mesa? I already asked. Then you might want me to know what I own before I answer. That stopped him. Not because he liked it. Because it made sense. Gideon turned toward the door. Guest room's upstairs, second door. I'll find it. He stopped at the threshold. I don't need a Kansas ranch owner telling my men how to run cattle. Maggie looked down at the ledger. And I don't need a New Mexico cowboy telling me what my signature is worth. Gideon nearly answered. Instead, he walked out. Maggie heard his boots cross the porch. Heavy steps. Then nothing. He had been angry, yet he had never raised his voice, never crowded the desk, never made her move so he could pass. She looked toward the doorway after he was gone, then returned to the numbers. By sundown, Maggie had read 3 years of cattle purchases and 2 years of feed accounts. After supper, she carried a lamp upstairs. The guest room was narrow but clean. Iron bed, washstand, 1 chair. A window looking west toward the red ridges. She unpacked only what she needed. At the bottom of her valise lay the small brass key Isaiah had left her. No label, no explanation. Only the key and his worn notebook with several pages missing. Maggie closed her fingers around it. Then she slipped it beneath her pillow. Downstairs, a door opened. Gideon crossed the yard towards the barn, carrying a lantern. She watched from the window. The lantern looked strangely small in his hand. He stopped at the corral where the young bay colt stood near the rail. Gideon did not enter. He rested his forearms on the fence and waited. After a while, the colt walked to him. Maggie turned away from the window. She had work to do. Near midnight, the house had gone still. The lamp burned low beside Harvey's ledger. Maggie compared the ranch tally with the collateral schedule Dunning had left behind. Once, then again. She took a clean sheet of paper and began from the beginning. Breeding cows, steers, yearlings, replacement heifers, bulls. She checked purchases against sales, losses against recorded deaths, spring calves against the previous year's cows. Her pencil stopped. Maggie sat back. No. She counted a 3rd time. The result did not change. According to High Mesa's own working records, the ranch carried roughly 80 fewer cattle than the number listed as security on the bank loan. Maggie brought the lamp closer. There were no sale receipts accounting for them. No mortality entries, no transfer, nothing. Yet the bank was lending money as if those cattle stood somewhere on High Mesa grass. She opened Isaiah's old notebook. His last figures were lower. Much lower. Maggie looked toward the dark window. Somewhere beyond it, cattle shifted softly beneath the New Mexico stars. She lowered her eyes to the 2 sets of numbers. 80 cattle, maybe more. Cattle that existed in debt. Cattle that existed in ink, but perhaps had never existed anywhere else. And someone had borrowed money against every one of them. Gideon found Maggie at the kitchen table before sunrise. The lamp was still burning beside her. 3 ledgers lay open between an untouched cup of coffee and a sheet covered with columns of figures. He stopped in the doorway. You sleep? Not enough to make these numbers change. She pushed the bank schedule toward him. Gideon pulled out the chair opposite her. Maggie tapped 1 column. According to Dunning's collateral schedule, High Mesa pledged 82 more head than I can account for in Harvey's working books. Cattle get lost. 82? Over enough country, yes. Then there should be something. Death loss, sale receipts, missing calves, strays reported by neighboring outfits. Gideon rubbed a thumb along his jaw. You've been here one day. Maggie closed the ledger. Then count them with me. He looked at her. She waited. No challenge in her voice now. No need to win the argument. Just the numbers sitting between them. Finally, Gideon stood. Saddle at first light. The first count took them across the north pasture, where the grass was already losing its spring green beneath the June sun. Maggie carried Isaiah's notebook inside her jacket and a small tally book in her saddlebag. Gideon rode ahead only far enough to choose the route. They counted by brand, sex, and age, breeding cows first, then steers, then yearlings. At every water point, Maggie stopped and checked her marks. By noon, Dust had settled into the seams of her skirt and across the toes of her boots. They ate beneath a cottonwood beside a dry creek bed, bread, cold beef, 2 apples, and coffee from Gideon's dented tin pot. He watched Maggie add a column. "You always count while you eat?" "Only when someone tells me my counting is wrong." His mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. They rode again. Late that afternoon, they reached a wash filled with loose stone. Maggie's mare tested the slope, slipped once, and tossed her head. Gideon turned his horse. "There's another crossing half a mile north. That'll cost us an hour." "Maybe." Maggie studied the rocks. Then she dismounted. Gideon expected her to hand him the reins. She didn't. She led the mare carefully down on foot. After a moment, Gideon swung out of his own saddle. Maggie glanced back. "You don't have to walk." "Neither do you." He took his horse by the bridle and came down beside her. That was all. The next morning they counted the south herd. Near midday, Ben Miller rode over to help. At 24, Ben was quick with a rope and quicker with conversation. When Maggie prepared to mount after checking a calf tally, Ben stepped forward with his hands ready. "I can give you a lift, ma'am." Before he touched her, Gideon spoke from several yards away. "Ask her." Ben stopped. Maggie looked toward Gideon. He was tightening a cinch and did not look back. Ben cleared his throat. "Would you like a hand, Miss Ellis?" "No, thank you." She mounted using the stirrup. Nothing more was said. But that evening, while Maggie copied the day's tally into the ledger, she remembered it. Ask her. 2 words, from a man who could have moved almost anyone wherever he pleased. By sunset on the second day, the answer was sitting on Harvey's desk. 82. Exactly 82 head. Gideon stood behind Maggie while she laid the ranch tally beside the bank schedule. "No wolves took 82 cattle without leaving bones," she said, "and nobody sold 82 without money changing hands." Gideon leaned over the pages. "What if Harvey entered them wrong?" Maggie opened another book. "These additions appear across several months." She pointed to the ink. "Same shade, same pressure." Then she opened Isaiah's notebook. "My uncle made his 7s like this. A short top stroke, then a line through the stem." She pointed to the altered entries. "These don't." Gideon stared. "You sure?" Maggie slid both pages toward him. "Look for yourself." He did, for a long time. Then he straightened. "I'm sure now." Maggie looked up. It was the first time Gideon had crossed the distance between doubting her and believing her without being dragged across it. He picked up his hat. "I'll check the brands again tomorrow. I'll check the loan dates." He nodded. Neither said that they were working together now. They simply were. 2 mornings later, Maggie stepped outside and heard no water running into the horse trough. She found Gideon beyond the lower corral, following the wooden flume toward the rocky cut west of the barn. The water came from a spring higher in the foothills and traveled through rough timber sections pinned together along the slope. One section had dropped. Gideon crouched beside it. "What happened?" He touched a loosened fastening. "Could be age." "You don't sound convinced." "I'm not convinced of anything yet." He looked uphill. "Go back. I'll handle it." Maggie folded her arms. "You always tell people to leave when you don't know the answer. Mostly when I'm about to stand in cold water." She almost smiled. Almost. Before dawn the following morning, the sound of a hammer woke her. Maggie dressed and followed it. She found Gideon ankle-deep in the runoff with Ben and another hand. His shirt was dark at the shoulders. A wrench hung from his belt, and fresh-cut timber lay beside the damaged section. He had been working long enough for steam to rise faintly from the coffee cup, sitting untouched on a rock. By breakfast, water was running into the trough again. Gideon came into the kitchen with wet boots and sleeves rolled to his elbows. Maggie poured coffee. "Why didn't you tell me you were fixing it?" He took the cup. It needed fixing more than it needed talking about. He drank. Maggie watched him over the rim of her own cup. She had known men who announced every kindness before they performed it. Gideon Tate seemed almost suspicious of being thanked. So she didn't thank him. The next morning she left coffee on the workbench in the barn. Gideon found it there. He looked toward the house. Maggie was already walking toward Harvey's office with a ledger beneath her arm. He drank every drop. 3 days later, Lloyd Barrett rode into High Mesa with 2 men behind him. Barrett owned cattle south of Blackstone Pass. He wore a tan hat with a narrow silver band and sat his horse like a man accustomed to arriving where he was not wanted. Gideon met him at the yard. Maggie came out of the office when she heard voices. Barrett removed a folded paper from his coat. "You'll need another route for your fall drive." Gideon did not take the paper. "What are you talking about?" "Blackstone. That trail's been used by High Mesa since before you bought your first steer." "Used, not owned." Barrett handed the paper to Maggie instead. She read it. The document claimed Harvey Whitlock had surrendered High Mesa's right of passage through Blackstone Pass. Maggie looked at the signature, then the date. Gideon stepped closer. "How far's the other route?" Barrett smiled. "You know how far." They both did. The southern detour would add days to the drive. In early autumn, that could mean cattle arriving light, exhausted, or after the contracted rail date. Barrett put on his gloves. "Just thought you deserved warning." Gideon's jaw hardened. Barrett saw it. He seemed to enjoy seeing it. Maggie folded the document. "I'm keeping this copy." Barrett looked at her. "I don't imagine bookkeeping changes a mountain pass, Miss Ellis." Maggie slipped the paper beneath her arm. "No, but it sometimes changes who owns one." Barrett's smile thinned. He mounted and rode away. That night, Maggie searched Isaiah's notebook again. She turned every page slowly. Near the back, beneath 2 feed calculations, she found a faint line that had been crossed through once. She carried the lamp closer. "Blackstone remains with High Mesa. Copy filed at Red Creek." The next morning, she and Gideon rode to town. Red Creek was little more than 2 dusty streets, a general store, a smithy, a hotel, the bank, and the county records room, sharing a brick building near the courthouse. Charles Dunning happened to be there when they arrived. The clerk searched the easement records, then searched again. Nothing. Maggie placed Isaiah's notebook on the counter. "There should be a copy." Dunning glanced at the line. "Maybe your uncle remembered wrong." Maggie lifted her eyes. He didn't. For the first time, Dunning's pleasant expression held a fraction too long. Gideon saw it. So did Maggie. Neither spoke of it until they were halfway home. "You trust your uncle that much?" Gideon asked. "Yes." "Even after what people said about him?" Maggie kept her eyes on the road. "Especially after what people said about him." Gideon did not ask more. The afternoon sun was low when High Mesa came into sight. Ben met them near the barn. Something in his face made Gideon dismount before the horse fully stopped. "What?" Ben pointed toward the small records shed beside the bunkhouse. "Thought you'd better see." Gideon crossed the yard. There were wagon tracks in the dirt. Fresh ones. The shed door was closed. The lock was intact. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed at first. Then Maggie stepped to the rear shelf. A clean rectangle showed through the dust. Something had been removed. She checked the handwritten inventory Harvey had kept inside the door. Old survey papers, livestock receipts, correspondence from the early partnership years. Gone. Gideon stood in the doorway, filling most of it. "No broken lock." "No," Maggie said. His eyes moved to the fresh wagon tracks outside. "Tuh. Then whoever came either had a key." Maggie finished the thought. "Or knew where one was kept." The evening wind pushed dust across the yard, slowly softening the tracks. Maggie looked toward the ranch house, then the bunkhouse, then the road disappearing west toward Red Creek. Someone had known they were asking about old records. Someone had known exactly where High Mesa kept them. And whoever it was had reached the papers before Gideon and Maggie even knew they needed them. For the next week, nothing happened. That was almost worse. Gideon replaced the lock on the records shed and moved the remaining papers into Harvey's old office. Maggie made an inventory of every deed, receipt, bill of sale, and cattle tally still on the ranch. Neither said they expected another theft. Neither left the office unlocked. By July, the grass had gone from green to the faded yellow of a New Mexico summer. Dust followed horses along the ranch road and hung behind them long after they passed. Then Red Creek began closing its doors to High Mesa without actually saying so. The general store stopped extending 30-day credit. A feed merchant postponed a delivery. One cattle buyer who had planned to inspect High Mesa's steers sent a short note saying he had other obligations. Ben Miller brought the note to Maggie. She read it twice. He was coming Tuesday. Was. Why'd he change his mind? Ben shifted his hat. Heard something in town? Gideon looked up from the saddle he was repairing. What? Ben hesitated. Folks saying High Mesa won't make fall. The leather strap in Gideon's hand went still. Maggie folded the note. Who started it? Couldn't say. But 2 days later, she could. A flour merchant in Red Creek mentioned Charles Dunning had advised several businesses to be cautious about High Mesa accounts until the ranch's uncertain ownership was resolved. Maggie returned home near sunset and found Gideon saddling his horse. Where are you going? Red Creek. No. He pulled the cinch tight. Maggie stepped closer. What are you going to do? Walk into Dunning's bank angry? If he's telling merchants we're failing, he wants you angry where people can see you. Gideon stopped. His right hand closed around the saddle horn. The knuckles went pale. Maggie knew about the old fight now. Ben had mentioned it without meaning to. Years ago, before High Mesa had settled Gideon down, a saloon quarrel had ended badly enough that the story still followed him. A man Gideon's size did not get the luxury of an ordinary temper. Maggie watched his hand. After several seconds, his fingers loosened. He took his hat off and hung it back on the peg. What do you suggest? It was the first time he had asked her that before deciding for himself. We keep records, Maggie said. Every canceled order, every merchant Dunning speaks to, every payment we make. Gideon nodded. And Barrett? We let him wonder why you haven't done something foolish yet. That earned the smallest change around Gideon's eyes. Then the summer storm came. It had been building all afternoon over the Sangre de Cristo foothills, dark clouds piling above the ridges, while the air at High Mesa stayed hot and still. By supper, thunder rolled in the distance. At 10, rain struck the roof. At midnight, the dogs started barking. Gideon woke before the second bark. Then he heard the cattle, not the low, scattered sounds of a herd shifting in bad weather. This was different. Hundreds of hooves moving at once. He was out of his room before he had fully buttoned his shirt. Ben! A lantern flared in the bunkhouse. Gideon crossed the yard at a run. The north pasture gate stood open, not broken, open. The chain hung from the post. Someone had lifted it free. Get the horses! Behind him, the ranch house door opened. Maggie came down the steps pulling on her coat. North herd? Moving toward the ravine. I'm coming. Maggie, she passed him. You can argue after we get them back. There was no time to answer. The herd had spread across the dark pasture, frightened by thunder and driven by the cattle behind them. Gideon rode hard toward the western edge, where the ground dropped into a rocky ravine. Turn the leaders! Ben and two other hands swung wide. Lightning showed the pasture for one white instant. Cattle everywhere. Gideon pushed his horse across the front of the moving herd, shouting, turning the first animals away from the drop. Maggie stayed farther back. She knew she could not outride Gideon. She did something more useful. She counted. Ben, take 2 men east. He barely heard her over the storm. What? The yearlings! They're not with this bunch. She had memorized the tally from their count. The main herd was too heavy in mature cows. A younger group was missing. Maggie rode toward the dry wash. She found tracks cut fresh into the wet dirt. There. 3 ranch hands followed her. The yearlings had broken away from the main herd and moved east, where the wash narrowed between low rock walls. Maggie divided the men. 1 around the north side, 2 with me. Don't crowd them. Back at the ravine, Gideon and Ben had nearly turned the main herd when Ben's horse shied sideways. A loose rope caught against his stirrup. The horse lunged. Ben went off balance. Gideon saw it. He was out of his saddle almost before Ben hit the ground. Hold still! He caught the rope and freed it from the stirrup. The frightened horse jerked away. Gideon stepped back too late. His left shoulder struck a heavy fence brace. The impact drove him to one knee. For several seconds he stayed there. Ben crawled clear. Gideon? I'm fine. He wasn't. When he tried to raise his left arm, it stopped halfway. He mounted anyway. By the time Maggie returned with the missing yearlings, rain was running from the brim of her hat. She saw the way Gideon held his arm. What happened? Nothing. Ben answered for him. Fence brace. Maggie looked at Gideon. Get down. We still have cattle out. You can't use that arm. I can ride. She moved her mare directly in front of his horse. Gideon stared at her through the rain. Move. No. Maggie, then ride where I tell you. Even Ben went quiet. Gideon could have ridden around her. Instead, he looked toward the scattered cattle, then toward the men waiting for direction. Finally, he nodded. All right. Maggie sent him to the western edge, where he could use his presence and voice without roping. She took the tally. Ben handled the riders. For the next 2 hours, they worked that way. Not Gideon's ranch, not Maggie's books, High Mesa. By dawn, the last cattle were behind a closed gate. Maggie counted twice. No losses. The rain weakened to a soft tapping against the barn roof. Gideon sat on an overturned feed crate while Maggie opened his shirt far enough to examine the shoulder. Lift it, he tried. Stop. I barely moved. That was enough. She wrapped the shoulder with clean cloth from the house. Because of his height, Gideon had to lean toward her. For a moment, neither spoke. The barn smelled of wet leather, hay, and horses. Rainwater ran from the roof in a steady line outside. Maggie pulled the bandage tight. Gideon winced. She looked up. Their faces were closer than either expected. Neither moved. Then Gideon said quietly, I was wrong about you. Maggie returned her attention to the knot. That covers a lot of ground. Most of it. A small laugh escaped her. Gideon looked at her. He had never heard that sound from her before. Maggie finished the knot. There. Thank you. Don't lift anything heavy. Gideon looked around the barn. That eliminates most of my day. Then you'll have to discover what the rest of us are for. 3 days later, Maggie found him trying to lift a saddle one-handed. She took it from him. He frowned. You planning to do that every morning? Until you stop pretending your shoulder healed overnight. He let her. The following afternoon, Maggie entered Harvey's office and found a small wooden stool beside the highest record shelf. She stared at it. She had never asked for one. That evening, Gideon came in with the cattle ledger. Thinking of moving 40 steers to the lower pasture, Maggie opened the book. How long? Week, maybe 2. She checked the feed figures. Move 30. Why? Because if the north grass holds, the other 10 gain more weight where they are. Gideon considered it. 30 then. He walked out. Maggie looked after him. A month earlier, he had closed that same ledger beneath her hand. Now he brought it to her before making a decision. The ranch hands noticed too. So did Maggie. Coffee began appearing on Gideon's workbench most mornings. He repaired the loose buckle on her saddle without mentioning it. They checked the water line together at sunset. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. One evening, Ben asked, "You want these invoices in Miss Ellis's office or yours?" Gideon answered without looking up, "Ours." The word hung there. Maggie heard it from across the room. Gideon realized what he had said. Neither corrected him. Then the letter came from Kansas. It arrived with the weekly mail in a cream envelope bearing the name Atwood Livestock Company. Gideon saw it on the kitchen table. He did not touch it. He did not ask. 2 days later, passing Harvey's office, he heard Maggie speaking with Walter Price. "Atwood is prepared to buy my entire 1/3 interest once the title dispute is settled." Gideon stopped outside the door. Price said something too low to hear. Maggie answered, "I haven't decided." Gideon walked away before she knew he had been there. At supper that evening, something had changed. "Salt, Miss Ellis?" Maggie looked up. Miss Ellis. Not Maggie. She passed him the salt. The next mornings there was no conversation at the water trough. By the third day, she had had enough. She found him near the corral at sunset. "You think I'm leaving?" Gideon continued coiling a rope. "Aren't you?" "I haven't decided." "That's not the same as staying." Maggie went still. "You heard about Atwood?" "Yes. And instead of asking me, you decided what it meant." He set the rope down. "You came here for your uncle. You settle his business, sell your share, go back to Kansas. Makes sense. To you. To anybody." Maggie stepped closer. The last light caught the dust between them. "You never asked me to stay." Gideon looked at her. For once, the man who always seemed to have control of his hands, his horse, his voice, and his anger had nothing. Maggie waited. He said nothing. That silence answered more than she wanted it to. She turned toward the house. "Maggie." She stopped, but Gideon still could not find the words. So she went inside. That night she sat beside the window with Isaiah's key in her palm. High Mesa lay quiet under the stars. She had come west to clear her uncle's name. She would do that. She would find the missing records. She would find out who had created 82 cattle out of ink and debt. She would help keep High Mesa standing long enough to finish what Isaiah had begun. And when it was done, she would go back to Kansas. Not because there was nothing here she wanted. That was the trouble. There was. But Maggie Ellis would not build a life in a place where she was valued only because her hands could balance the books and save the ranch. If Gideon Tate wanted her work, he already had it. If he wanted her to stay, he would have to find the courage to say why. He did not find it the next morning. Maggie came into the kitchen shortly after 6. Gideon was already outside. No coffee waited on his workbench. At breakfast, they discussed cattle weight, the railroad date, and a cracked wheel on the supply wagon. Nothing else. For the next several days, High Mesa ran on a strange kind of silence. Gideon still checked Maggie's saddle before long rides. One morning she found the girth buckle newly stitched where the leather had begun to split. She knew whose hands had done it. She said nothing. Maggie still kept track of the liniment the doctor in Red Creek had given Gideon for his shoulder. When he forgot it twice, the small brown bottle appeared beside his plate at supper. He looked at it, then at her. She kept reading an invoice. Neither apologized. Neither mentioned Kansas. The railroad shipment was now less than 3 weeks away, and Blackstone Pass was still in dispute. Maggie spent her days rebuilding the paper trail from whatever remained. She compared feed receipts with cattle tallies, checked Harvey's old correspondence, and copied every entry connected to Charles Dunning's bank. The deeper she went, the less sense the debt made. Payments Isaiah had mentioned in his notebook did not appear against the bank balance. Some loan dates matched the false cattle entries almost exactly, but suspicion was not proof. One afternoon, Maggie rode into Red Creek alone. She stopped first at George Bell's smithy. The place smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. George was 44, broad through the chest, with a leather apron over his shirt and gray beginning at his beard. He had known Isaiah. At the sound of the name, he set his hammer down. "Your uncle used to stand right there," George said, pointing toward the open doorway. "Would talk numbers while I worked. Never understood how a man could remember 6 months of receipts and forget where he left his hat." Maggie smiled faintly. "Did he ever talk about Blackstone Pass?" George's expression changed. "Once." "When?" "Not long before he died. He had a receipt with him. Said Harvey had finally signed something that would keep High Mesa safe." "What kind of receipt?" "Don't know. I witnessed Isaiah's signature because he asked me to. Figured it was ranch business." "Did Dunning know?" George looked toward the street. Dunning knew most things involving money in Red Creek. That was not proof either, but Maggie wrote it down. From there, she went to Agnes Whitlock's house at the north end of town. Agnes lived in a narrow adobe home behind a row of cottonwoods. Harvey's older sister opened the door wearing a faded blue dress and spectacles on a cord. She recognized Maggie immediately. "You have Isaiah's eyes." Maggie had heard that before. It still caught her. Agnes made coffee. They sat at a small kitchen table while late afternoon sunlight moved across the floor. "Harvey and Isaiah argued near the end," Agnes said. "With each other?" "No." Agnes looked toward the window. "With Charles Dunning." Maggie stopped writing. "About what?" "Harvey never told me. He only said Charles had gone too far." "When was this?" "A few months before Isaiah died." Agnes rubbed one thumb across the handle of her cup. "There was a box." Maggie looked up. "What box?" "Harvey kept a strong box in his ranch office. Old iron thing. Heavy as sin. One night he told me, if anything happens, the box stays closed until Isaiah says otherwise." "Where is it?" "I thought it was still at High Mesa." Maggie's hand moved slowly to the chain beneath her collar. She pulled out the small brass key. Agnes stared at it. "Oh." Maggie did not finish her coffee. She reached High Mesa after dark. Gideon was waiting by the gate with a lantern. "You rode back alone after sundown." It came out sharper than he intended. Maggie dismounted. "I've done it before. That road crosses open country." "I noticed." He took the mare's reins, then stopped himself. "May I?" Maggie looked at him. "Yes." He led the horse toward the barn. "I found something," she said. Gideon turned. 10 minutes later, they were in Harvey's old office. Maggie told him about Agnes. Gideon frowned. "I've never seen a strongbox. Agnes said it was here." They searched the desk first, then the cabinet, then beneath the bed in Harvey's old room. Nothing. Gideon stood in the office doorway, thinking. "Harvey replaced this floor 3 years ago." Maggie looked down. Most of the boards were worn smooth, except beneath the old records cabinet. They moved it together. One plank had 2 small nail heads that did not match the others. Gideon crouched. He worked the board loose with the flat end of a pry bar. Beneath it sat an iron box covered in dust. Maggie stopped breathing for a moment. Gideon lifted it onto the desk. Even with his shoulder still stiff, the weight made him brace himself. The lock was small. Maggie took the key from her neck. It slid in. One turn, the lock opened. There was no money inside. No gold. No hidden fortune. Only paper. Maggie lifted the first folded document. A survey map. The second carried a notary seal. She opened it. Blackstone Pass. The original easement preserved High Mesa's right of passage. Gideon leaned over her shoulder. "Barrett's paper is worthless. If this holds, it will. Keep looking." Beneath the easement were cattle receipts, canceled notes, and a second ledger. Maggie opened it. Her hands slowed. She knew the writing. Isaiah, page after page. Loan payments, cattle numbers, dates, then the 82 head. Maggie pulled Harvey's ledger from the shelf and set the two books side by side. The false cattle appeared in the ranch books after Isaiah's entries had been made. Exactly 82. At the bottom of the box lay a sealed letter. Isaiah Ellis was written across the front. Maggie opened it. The letter was from Harvey. He had never sent it. She read silently, then again. Gideon watched her face change. "What is it?" Maggie sat down. "Isaiah found them." "The cattle?" She nodded. "He found the false collateral entries. He confronted Dunning." Her finger moved farther down the page. Harvey wrote that Isaiah had discovered payments disappearing from the loan account. Dunning denied wrongdoing. Soon afterward, stories began circulating that Isaiah himself had taken ranch money. Harvey had intended to bring the books before territorial authorities. Then his health failed. Maggie reached the last line. Her hand stopped. For months, she had carried the question west with her. Maybe Isaiah had made a mistake. Maybe grief had made her defend a man who had done something she did not understand. Now Harvey's handwriting sat beneath her fingers. Isaiah had not stolen from High Mesa. He had tried to save it. Maggie touched her uncle's name once. No tears fell. She simply sat there. Gideon remained outside the doorway. He could have crossed the room in 2 steps. He did not. Minutes passed. Finally, Maggie looked toward him. "Come in." Only then did he enter. They worked until after midnight. The second ledger changed everything. Canceled notes showed payments High Mesa had made, but Dunning's current account did not credit. Receipts connected several debt instruments to buyers acting for Lloyd Barrett. Other entries showed Dunning quietly acquiring notes against ranch operations, while Barrett increased pressure around Blackstone Pass. Maggie placed one receipt beside another. "He doesn't need to own High Mesa today." Gideon understood. "He needs us to miss the shipment." She nodded. "No shipment, no cattle payment. No payment, the loan defaults. And Barrett closes the pass, while Dunning makes sure nobody in Red Creek extends us credit." Gideon looked toward the dark window. Barrett had been the man standing in the yard. Dunning had been the man smiling behind a desk. Then Gideon remembered something. The day after Maggie arrived, Dunning had caught him outside the bank. Women with paper don't stay once they see cash. At the time, Gideon had believed it because he was already afraid of the same thing. Now the sentence sounded different. Placed, deliberate. Dunning had not simply wanted High Mesa to fail. He had wanted Gideon suspicious of Maggie, and Gideon had helped him. His eyes went to the empty coffee cup on Harvey's desk. "You were right." Maggie kept sorting receipts. "About which part?" "Me deciding what you meant without asking." Her hands stopped. Gideon swallowed. "I made it easier for him." Maggie looked at him. "He used what was already there." "That doesn't make it better." "No." The answer hurt because it was honest. Gideon nodded. Then Maggie gathered the easement, ledger, receipts, and Harvey's letter. "What are you doing?" "Going to Red Creek." "Now?" "At first light." "To Dunning?" "To the records office first. Then Sheriff Keene. Dunning can explain himself after the documents are somewhere he can't make them disappear." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "All right." She expected him to say he was coming. He did not. At dawn, Maggie saddled her mare. She had just cleared the ranch gate when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Gideon rode up on her right. "You don't have to come." "I know." "You're not going to tell me what to do?" "No." She looked at him. "Why?" He adjusted the reins. "Because you know where you're going." For several miles they rode side by side. Not Gideon ahead. Not Maggie following. The road climbed toward Blackstone, Morning light reached the red cliffs. Then Gideon slowed. Across the pass stood a new fence. Fresh posts, fresh wire. Lloyd Barrett waited on the other side with 3 riders. Sheriff Martin Keene stood nearby, his horse tied to a juniper. Barrett smiled when he saw Gideon. "Morning, Big Tate." Gideon dismounted. Sheriff Keene raised a hand. "Before you do anything, hear me." Barrett filed notice on the pass. "You tear that fence down before this gets settled, I'll have to arrest you." Maggie dismounted with the document case in her hand. Barrett looked at Gideon, not her. "That shouldn't be hard for you." Gideon walked toward the fence. Every eye followed him. His shoulder was nearly healed. His hands were more than strong enough to pull a rail loose. Barrett knew it. Sheriff Keene knew it. Maggie knew it. Gideon stopped with one hand resting on the fresh wood. Behind that fence lay the only route that could get High Mesa's cattle to the railroad on time. Behind him stood Maggie with the papers that might save everything. Barrett's smile widened. "Go on, Big Tate." Gideon's fingers closed around the rail. The fresh pine creaked beneath his hand. Barrett watched from the other side of the fence with the satisfied look of a man who believed the last move had already been made. Sheriff Keene stood 20 feet away. So did 3 of Barrett's riders. Farther down the trail, 2 freight wagons had stopped to see what was happening. Everyone was watching Gideon, waiting for the giant cowboy to become the story they already knew how to tell. Gideon looked at the fence. Then he opened his hand. He stepped back. Barrett's smile disappeared. Gideon turned toward Maggie. "Show them." For a moment, she did not move. Months earlier, this man had closed a ledger beneath her hand and told her paper did not teach a person the ground. Now he was putting High Mesa into those same hands. Maggie carried the document case to Sheriff Keene. She opened it on the hood of a freight wagon. "No speeches," she said. "Just dates." First came the original Blackstone Pass easement. The notary seal was faded but intact. Then Harvey's survey map. Then Isaiah's ledger. Then the canceled notes and payment receipts. Keene removed his hat and bent over them. Maggie pointed with one finger. High Mesa's passage was never surrendered. Barrett's document contradicts this easement. Barrett stepped forward. "That old paper proves nothing. It proves enough to stop pretending your fence settled the question." She turned another page. "These are the 82 cattle added to High Mesa's collateral schedule. They appear in the bank account, but not in Isaiah Ellis's original tally." Keene frowned. 82 exactly?" "Exactly." Maggie placed 2 records beside each other. Same supposed cattle, different handwriting. Hoofbeats sounded behind them. George Bell had ridden out from Red Creek with Agnes Whitlock in a small buggy after hearing Keene had gone to the pass. George dismounted. Maggie handed him one of the receipts. "You recognize that?" George studied it. "I do." "Whose signature?" "Isaiah's. I watched him sign it." Agnes looked at the iron strongbox strapped behind Maggie's saddle. "That was Harvey's box." Keene glanced at her. You're certain?" "I saw it in his office for years." Maggie laid Harvey's unsent letter beside the ledger. Keene read in silence. Barrett's face had changed. Not fear. Calculation. He looked from the receipts to Maggie and finally toward the road leading back to Red Creek. "Dunning told me that easement was gone." Nobody answered. Barrett looked at Keene. "He said High Mesa would default before shipment, said the notes would be clean." Maggie watched him carefully. There it was. Not a confession to everything, but enough to show where the trail continued. Barrett seemed to realize he had said too much. His anger turned toward Gideon. He crossed the distance between them. "This is your doing." Gideon did not move. Barrett shoved both hands against his chest. Gideon shifted half a step. That was all. One of Barrett's riders looked away. Barrett shoved him again. Gideon's hands stayed at his sides. "You finished?" Barrett stared up at him. The difference between them was almost absurd. Gideon could have ended the confrontation with one swing. Everybody there knew it. That was precisely why he did not. Sheriff Keene stepped between them. "That's enough." Barrett pointed toward the fence. "It's on my ground." Keene picked up the easement. "Maybe the fence is. The passage isn't." He looked toward his deputy, who had just arrived from Red Creek. "Open it." Barrett swore under his breath. Keene's expression hardened. "You can argue ownership before the territorial court. Until then, I'm not letting you block a recorded right-of-way with a document that may be fraudulent." The wire came down. Gideon watched the opening appear through Blackstone Pass. Then he looked at Maggie. Neither smiled. They had no time. The railroad contract was still waiting. High Mesa began moving cattle before noon. The herd entered Blackstone Pass in a rolling cloud of red dust, bells knocking softly among the led animals. Gideon rode the western side. Maggie rode east. Ben Miller and the other hands kept the rear from spreading along the narrow trail. They pushed until sunset, then again before daylight. The pass opened onto flatter country, but the cattle were tired and the heat came early. Nobody talked much. At a creek crossing, Maggie handed Gideon a tin cup. He drank and passed it back. "You holding up?" She wiped dust from her mouth. "Ask me at the railroad." He almost smiled. They rode on. By the final afternoon, the loading pens came into view beside the tracks. A locomotive stood beyond them, breathing steam into the dry air. The shipping agent checked his watch when Gideon rode up. "You cut that close." Gideon looked back. Maggie was bringing the last group through the gate. "Still counts." The agent checked the cattle against the contract. The payment draft was issued before dark. It was not enough to make High Mesa rich. It was enough to keep it alive. That mattered more. The investigation took weeks. Sheriff Keene sent copies of Maggie's evidence to the territorial authorities. Charles Dunning's accounts were examined. Payments High Mesa had made but never received credit for began appearing in old bank records. The debt was recalculated, then reduced. Barrett's Blackstone claim collapsed with the false documents supporting it. Dunning was removed from control of the disputed accounts, while the fraud and falsified loan records were investigated. There was no dramatic arrest in the middle of Main Street, just a locked bank office one morning, 2 territorial men carrying boxes of records outside, and Charles Dunning standing behind the glass, watching the town discover that respectability and honesty had never been the same thing. For Maggie, one matter remained. She went to Red Creek with Harvey's letter and Isaiah's ledger. George Bell came with her. Agnes came too. Walter Price entered the corrected documents into the estate record. Isaiah Ellis's name was no longer attached to missing ranch money. Maggie stood at the clerk's counter while the final notation dried. She touched the edge of the page. That was all. On the ride home, Gideon did not ask whether she was all right. He simply stayed beside her. Autumn settled over Cimarron Valley. The mornings turned cold. High Mesa survived. And then the danger was gone. That was when the harder question arrived. The Atwood Livestock Company renewed its offer for Maggie's 1/3 interest. A week later, Gideon received a letter from Wyoming. A large cattle outfit needed a foreman. Better wages, a house, steady work. Neither told the other what to do. One October morning, a wagon stood outside High Mesa. Maggie's trunk rested beside it. Gideon came down the porch steps. He looked at the trunk, then at Maggie. She wore the same brown traveling jacket she had worn the day she arrived. He bent and lifted the trunk into the wagon. Maggie watched him tie it down. He did not ask her to stay. That hurt more than she expected. But there was something else in the way he worked. Care. Even now, especially now. When he finished, Maggie said, "If I leave, what will you do?" Gideon looked toward the corral. Work. Wyoming? He was quiet. Maybe. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Maggie looked toward Harvey's old office, then the barn, then the long line of pasture beyond it. And if I stay? Gideon finally looked at her. For a man who had faced frightened horses, stampeding cattle, debt, and Barrett's hands against his chest without losing control, the question seemed to leave him with nowhere to hide. Then I'd have to stop pretending I don't know what I want. Maggie waited. He took off his hat. I wanted you gone because I thought you'd take my home from me. She said nothing. Then somewhere along the way, you became part of what home meant. His voice dropped. I want you here, Maggie. Not because High Mesa needs you. He looked directly at her. Because I do. Maggie's eyes stayed on his. You took your time. I know. You made a mess of it. I know that too. She turned toward the wagon. Gideon's face changed, but he did not reach for her. Maggie untied the rope around the trunk. She handed him the loose end. Put it back. He stared at her. Where? Maggie looked toward the house. Inside. For several seconds, Gideon did not move. Then his head lowered, and the smile that came was small enough that anyone farther away might have missed it. Maggie did not. He lifted the trunk down. This time they walked toward the house together. By spring, High Mesa looked different. Not richer, not easier, just steadier. Maggie's name appeared openly on the ranch accounts and ownership papers. Her 1/3 interest remained hers. Gideon managed cattle, horses, pasture, and the men. Major decisions crossed Harvey's old desk between them before either signature went beneath them. They argued sometimes. Maggie still won more arguments involving arithmetic. Gideon claimed that was because numbers had taken her side from the beginning. When they finally married, it was not to save High Mesa. The ranch had already been saved. It was not because Maggie needed Gideon's protection. She had already proven she could stand on her own ground. And Gideon did not marry her because he needed someone to make High Mesa a home. He married her because he had finally understood that home was not something a man protected by holding it too tightly. Sometimes it was something he made room for. One spring evening, Maggie stood at the corral watching the young bay horse Gideon had worked with the morning she first arrived. The horse came quietly to his hand now. Gideon looked across the fence at Maggie. What? She shook her head. Nothing. He knew better, but he let her keep it. The sun dropped behind the red ridges, spreading long shadows across High Mesa. The cattle moved quietly toward water. Blackstone Pass remained open. Isaiah Ellis's name was clean, and the giant cowboy who had once looked at Maggie Ellis and seen only a woman who might take his home away had learned, slowly and stubbornly, that loving her meant something entirely different. It meant never deciding for her, never making her smaller so he could feel larger. And when every debt, threat, and obligation that had once held them together was finally gone, it meant giving her the one thing that made staying matter. The freedom to leave. Maggie had that freedom. She stayed anyway, and maybe that was the truest thing High Mesa ever gave them. Gideon had spent years believing strength meant holding on, holding his temper, holding the ranch together, holding tight to the only place that had ever felt like home. Maggie came west carrying a different burden. She wanted her uncle's name returned to him, her own choices respected, and no man deciding what her future ought to be. Somewhere between dusty cattle trails, missing ledger pages, cold coffee, and long silences across Harvey's old desk, they learned that love could not be built from need alone. Gideon could protect a herd with his strength. Maggie could protect a legacy with truth and a steady hand. But neither could make the other stay. That choice had to be given freely. Maybe that is worth remembering when someone we love reaches a crossroads. Sometimes love is not asking them to give up the road ahead. Sometimes it is having the courage to leave the gate open and hoping they still choose the road home. So let me ask you one thing. If you were Maggie, would you have stayed? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about second chances, quiet courage, and people finding home in unexpected places mean something to you, I hope you'll subscribe and stay with us. There are more Western stories ahead, some mysterious, some heartbreaking, and some that just might leave a little healing behind long after the last sunset fades.